Okay. Dear Father, thank you very much for volunteering your time and coming aboard with little presentation. Your credentials as an author and as a professor are very well known. Your books are available through Amazon, so I'm not going to waste too much time by introducing you to the public and singing your praises. We're here for a slightly different thing. We're here to partake of the fruits of your labors, meaning to listen to your talk. So I'm turning my microphone to you and expect that myself and our listeners would benefit a great deal from what you have to offer to us tonight or today, or whoever is going to listen to this conversation. Depends on time and place where they are.
Thank you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, you are everywhere and fill all things, treasury of blessings, giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse our souls and save us from every impurity. Amen. Thank you for having me, Father Ilya, and whoever else is listening. My name is Michael Plekon. I have been attached to St. Gregory the Theologian Parish in Wappingers Falls since 1995. I retired from the City University of New York at the end of August 2017, 40 years to the day after I started teaching there, and I taught 5 years other places. But I still teach. I do Zoom talks like this for the cathedral in Washington, D.C. every Tuesday evening. Father George Kochno has me give a talk, and I do a couple of others for other people in various places too. And I continue to stay active as a scholar. Sometime later this year, my new book will come out. It's called Community as Church, Church as Community. And maybe later on, I'll talk a little bit about that. I taught at the City University of New York's Baruch College, which is named for Bernard M. Baruch, who was a financial advisor to several presidents, Hoover and FDR, and after that, Truman and Eisenhower. He was given the chance to get an education when he was very young. His parents were immigrants from Germany, and he was able to get an education at the City College of New York. He got a standard humanities education, which meant that he studied Hebrew and Greek and Latin and all of the classical things in philosophy and literature. And so when he was distributing his wealth toward the end of his life, he said to his alma mater, I want you to make sure that though you're setting up a business school, that all the students in that school also have to take more than half of their credits outside of business and in the humanities, so that they learn great literature, philosophy, the arts, languages, even, for example, the history of religions. And so the campus at which I taught for 40 years was precisely that. It was the business school, but we had a humanities or liberal arts division that was bigger than most liberal arts colleges. I think when I left, we had 32,000 students, and of those 32,000 students, more than half were in the liberal arts and sciences. So in teaching there over the years, I was able to use a lot of the research that I had done. And maybe 25 years ago, I did a study of a number of holy people from the Eastern Church. Some of them had already been made saints, like Seraphim of Sarov and now Mother Maria Skobtsova, but others were never canonized. Wonderful, wonderful people like Father Alexander Min, and also Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Meyendorf from our own country here, and Paul Evdokimov, a lay theologian, and Father Lev Gier, who had been a Catholic monk and priest and became an Orthodox priest monk, and was very important in the work in Paris with Father Bulgakov and so many others. After I did that book, I decided that I wanted to honor, as Father Alexander Men did, the whole of the church, the whole of the Christian tradition. And so I started branching out and asking or listening myself to many other authors, saints. Some of them were scholars, some of them were reformers and activists. And I produced 3 books. The first one I called Hidden Holiness, because what I wanted to look at is people whose lives were not necessarily obviously holy, in some cases not even obviously religious. So these would be people like a wonderful Dutch social worker named Eddie Hillesum, who ended up dying in Dachau, but who kept a diary and who for a while was able to write letters back to her family and friends and document the whole experience of trying to help people who were put into death camps and who knew that they would never get out of them alive. And though she had not much background or experience in faith, she was Jewish, she discovered God and became, as she put it, God's helper in these camps to the best of her ability. And then I also listened to a number of important writers. One that I've listened to a number of times, who I've gotten to know. I was at several conferences with him and visited him in London, is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who is, as you might know or might not know, fluent in Russian, wrote his doctoral dissertation on Vladimir Lossky, has as his favorite saint, he's shown me his icon, Seraphim of Sarov, and even was there when they opened the new restored church at St. Seraphim's Monastery. And I used some of his writings as well. So that book, Hidden Holiness, looked at a number of people whose lives were not well known, and I could talk for the rest of the afternoon or evening about them, but I have to move on. And the whole point was, most of us will live lives of hidden holiness. That is to say, our holiness will not be that of the great martyrs or even the great confessors of the faith, but our lives are quieter, they're more ordinary, and yet God calls us to find our place and our way of being holy in those lives. I then went on to look at saints as they really are. That is a line from Dorothy Day, who I'm sure you know is being considered for sainthood in the Catholic Church, and who spent most of her adult life down on the Lower East Side, running houses of hospitality, exactly the same as Mother Maria over in Paris. In fact, they were contemporaries of one another. They didn't know one another, however. And Dorothy Day was a great, how shall I say it, fan of the saints. And people would oftentimes ask her whether or not, she was trying to become a saint. And she would always laugh at them as she was smoking her cigarette. And she would say to them, well, if you knew anything about how saints really are or who they really are, you would realize that every one of us is called to be a saint, even with our defects, even with our weaknesses, even with our faults. All of that is what God uses to do God's work. And so I use that title to look at the lives and listen to the writings of a number of other people. So I looked, for example, at Dorothy Day's life in that book. I looked at the life of Thomas Merton, an American monk, and still today probably the best known and read author on the spiritual life. He spent all of his life in a monastery outside of Louisville, Kentucky, but he reached many people with his articles, with his books. Even toward the end of his life, he urged people to take a knowledge of and be aware of the civil rights struggle that was going on, the anti-war movement that was going on. And he died when he was still relatively young. He was just in his early 50s, when at a conference he was taking a shower later in the day, came out of the shower, turned on the fan, only to to be electrocuted because the fan had a short in it. And so we don't know what more he would have written. But his books on prayer, his books on how to put prayer and the work of your life together are still being read today. None of his books have gone out of print, and he died in 1968. So that says quite a lot about his force and power as an author. In that same book, I also did something that I had done before, and I looked into my own life. I thought to myself that it would be worthwhile sharing with people who would read my books something of the journey that I had been on. And I took just one little segment of my life from the time I was 13 years old to the time I was about 23, because in those years, I went away to what in those days was called a junior seminary or a minor seminary. They even had these in the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe many, many years ago. It would be where you would do like a gymnasium or a high school education, but with a particular focus on going on to the priesthood. So you would, of course, do Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and then all of the other subjects as well. You would have daily services. I remember all of us wore black suits and black ties. And when I visited the Moscow Academy, Theological Academy, I felt like I was stepping back into my childhood, because here were all these young men in black suits, white shirts, and black ties. I thought I was back in the seminary that I started out at. This seminary was a seminary of the Carmelite order, which had been around since the early Middle Ages. It was one of the orders of those who were called friars, because they didn't just stay in a monastery, but they lived together, prayed together, but then went out and did ministries like teaching, chaplaincy, took care of parishes, things like that. That's the kind of life that I thought was the one that God was calling me to. And I went all the way through the high school part of it. I entered the novitiate. I became a novice friar or monk. Then I went on to do my undergraduate studies, mostly in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University. And then I went out and taught high school for a year, and then decided to ask the dispensation of my vows and go back to ordinary life, because I wanted to have a wife and I wanted to have a family. I very much love the monastic life. I am a good friend of the communities of New Skeets still, and I've visited many other monasteries and stayed there for retreats. But I told that story simply because in it, I had interactions with a number of wonderful monks who had a sense of humor, who were human, down to earth, but were men of prayer, were men of holiness, and yet were not in any way unapproachable or inaccessible. And it's something that has always remained with me. And I wanted to write really more about them than about myself, about the, you might say, the friars of hidden holiness that I had met. And then that brought me to the book that I wanted to talk about today. And this book I called Uncommon Prayer. And it's a strange title for some people, because they say, well, I know that there is such a thing as the Book of Common Prayer that Anglicans all over the world, here in this country, Episcopalians use. It's a prayer book that is very much like the standard prayer book and missal that is used by Catholics and others in the Western Church. What I wanted to put forward, and Father Ilya sort of put this in the announcement, is that we have, of course, prayer that we're well aware of, the prayer in the liturgy, the prayer in our prayer books, all of the texts of the feasts, the Sunday Troparia and Kondakia. We also have, for example, the lives of saints. We have all kinds of hymns, special ones for the different seasons of the year. For Lent, for example, a special tone for the services, the pre-sanctified services. And then, of course, the wonderful services of Holy Week and of Pascha or Easter. Of course, that is the center of our prayer life. Those of us who have read and who have admired Father Alexander Schmemann know that for him, his message was always Start there. That is the very first theology. The liturgical services and the liturgical texts are really, after the scriptures, the most important treasure of tradition that we have. God is speaking to us in those prayers, just as much as we speak to God. It's also interesting to remember that all of the prayers in not just the Divine Liturgy, but in all the rest of the services are in the plural. It's always we, it's always us, it's always we are giving our thanks, our praise. We are begging God to be merciful to those who are sick, to remember those who have died. We, because we're praying as a community. And that was a very important part of prayer for the earliest Christians, for Jesus' own disciples, and it still should be for us today. But many of us know the saying of St. Paul, where he says, you should pray always, or you should pray all the time, depending on how you translate the word. And there have been people in the history of the church who have taken that literally. There were monasteries that were set up. In fact, I think that St. Seraphim even had a monastery of nuns who continually prayed the Psalms, the Psalter, and who continuously had services. I know when I finally got to visit the Trinity Surges Monastery outside Moscow, when we went into the church that Andrei Rublev had done the icons for, where St. Sergius is buried, there was a service going on. And the guy who was showing us around, the priest, said to me, he said, you know, this goes on all the time. He said, it even went on during the war. And it's basically a service to St. Sergius, a moleben. And on and on and on it went. And there was always somebody there doing it. I'm sure that they, of course, did the Divine Liturgy there when it was time in the morning, and they did Vespers and Matins and other services as well. But the idea was that this church was a place of almost perpetual prayer. Well, it's, if you look at that and say, I'm supposed to be saying prayers just as if I were reading them from a prayer book, or reading them from a book of the services, or even reading them out of the scriptures. How could I do that? I mean, I have a family, I have work, I have to eat, I have to sleep. How can I pray all the time? So I said to myself, I think if we listen again to the voices of people down through the history of the church, and in particular, if we listen to the voices of people today, I think we can find that prayer is not something that's restricted just to the church building, nor to the times when we are there for the services. In fact, now during the pandemic, all of us have discovered in various ways that one certainly can pray and not necessarily in the church when it is not safe to be in there, or when only a very few people can be in there. We've watched services, we've taken part in them on Zoom and on other platforms too. So the premise of this entire book is that, of course, one can pray anywhere, one can pray at any time. And sometimes prayer is there where you least expect it. So prayer could be when we're giving thanks before we eat, but why isn't the eating also prayer? In this book, I have a little chapter which, since I love to cook and I love to eat, I devoted to the prayer of pierogi making and other food adventures in church. So all of us who have had any experience with church, and this, by the way, is ecumenical or universal. It makes no difference what church body you're talking about. After the liturgy, the Lutherans used to say there is the next sacrament of the coffee hour, where we have been refreshed with the body and blood of Christ. But now we're breaking bread of another sort, maybe donuts, who knows? I mean, I've eaten everything at coffee hours, including gourmet foods. That is another sacrament, because what are we doing? We're seeing people together. We're seeing them refresh themselves, laugh, tell what's going on in their lives, share their joys, maybe even share their sorrows too. So pierogi making in my parish was part of the preparation for a big Christmas fair or bazaar that was always held on the first Sunday of December. And while there were all kinds of people who brought crafts, paintings, jewelry, metalwork, woodwork, and so forth to sell at this fair. The high point of the fair and what we were known for in the county was our food. And it was homemade. So we have homemade holutze. We had homemade borscht. We had all kinds of Middle Eastern food because we had some Lebanese families, kibbeh and tabbouleh and falafel. Of course, we also, one of our favorite lunch dishes was a big plate of kapusta with kovasa, kovasi. And the high point was that you could buy frozen borscht, you could buy frozen holubtse, stuffed cabbage, you could also buy pierogi. And before this, several months beforehand, we would have these pierogi making days that would start on a Saturday morning at maybe 7:30 or 8. There'd be coffee, there'd be some donuts or rolls. And then for the rest of the day, we would sometimes make as many as 400 or 500 dozen pierogi. While we were doing this, and we had a couple of machines, but most of the time we were, as my grandmother taught me, we were pinching them all together, right? I knew how to make them. And while people were using their hands, working with their hands, just like, for example, circles of women who would be, making a quilt or doing sewing together or something else like that, or even men, working on a carpentry project. When you use your hands, it somehow frees the rest of you up. And it's what St. Benedict called work as truly prayer. And so what people would do is that they would start talking to one another about things that normally they would never talk about, even over a cup of coffee. The working together kind of almost liberated them. And sometimes when I was squeezing pierogi there, and I was listening, maybe not even myself saying anything, I said to myself, I'm hearing people going to confession to one another. They're talking about a child whose troubles with addiction have plagued that child or that grandchild and the parents and the grandparents for years. I heard people talking about, the loss of a spouse, the loss of a job, about struggling with depression, about struggling with other things that had come into their lives unexpectedly. And of course, some people would, speak to me or to Father Alex, who were always there making pierogi with the others. But it was a wonderful example, and it drew me into things that Mother Maria Skoptsova wrote about her going out to the marketplaces and basically shaking down the vendors, for stuff that they had not sold at the end of the day, for bread that they didn't want to take back to the bakery, produce, even meat. And then, of course, bringing all this back to her house of hospitality and turning it into dinner, however, a soup or a stew or something, It made me think of the fact that this gathering to make these wonderful little edible things was not the only time that we enjoyed each other's company and eating and praying while we were doing this. We also did it, as I said, in the coffee hour every Sunday morning, but several times a year we would have a parish dinner. We would have it on the feast of St. Gregory the Theologian or the Sunday closest to it, and everybody would bring their own best dishes, and we would set up a big buffet table. And oh my gosh, that was such a wonderful feast. But we also did this during Lent. Now, obviously, the foods were different and simpler during Lent. They were without meat or cheese. But it was always amazing to see what people came with. And these we would have, would be brought, and we would have them after the pre-sanctified service. So we would have like a potluck supper. And then what also reminded me of this, we had a beloved member of our community who had battled cancer for years. She and her husband were both professional musicians who played not only in the local symphony orchestra and in several chamber groups, but who also were teachers. And he had been a music teacher at West Point for 20 years or more. She died in her long struggle with cancer. And so because of the many musician friends that they had and so many other people in the general community, her funeral services were almost like Pascha in a way. We had more people than even our church could hold. They were watching it on closed circuit TV in the hall. After the evening service, we asked everybody to bring in food. And again, we had something like we had at our feast, this enormous buffet table and people laughing. And even some of the musicians over in the corner playing Mozart and Schubert. And then, of course, the same after the funeral service in the morning. So I thought about this, and in this chapter, I tried to show how, while many people would say, well, you're eating, and eating is eating, after all. Eating is wonderful, it's beautiful, it's good. How is it prayer? Well, certainly, I think those of you who have any experience in parish life, if you listen to me for the last 5 minutes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Making things together, whether it's pierogi, whether it's nut rolls or poppy seed rolls, whether it's baking the bulkas, the paschal breads, whether it's just simply having a feast for a feast day, or even a repast, a feast after a funeral. There's a sense in which all of these are great experiences of community, of joy, of sharing, and they're also prayer. This is the liturgy after the liturgy, as Mother Maria called it, echoing St. John Chrysostom. So in this book, Uncommon Prayer, I spent a long chapter talking about this. And then I decided, well, since, I've already once or twice or more written about things in my own life that might have some interest for others, since I had spent the better part of my adult life in the classroom, week after week after week, year after year, I decided to go back to my notes and write about prayer in the classroom. And so, for example, I took a scene that I will never forget when we were reading the memoir of a woman who, with her sister, struggled with an emotionally very ill mother, and who had to sometimes actually stay up at night because she would be threatening physical danger to them. One of the students who presented this chapter presented what happened in the memoir, and then said, but I've lived this. She was Chinese American, and she was from a family of, I think, 4 children, but she had both of her grandparents on both sides of the family living with her. And of those 4 grandparents, half of them, 2 of them, were suffering from Alzheimer's. And so to have people not aware of where they were, sometimes yelling and screaming and crying, and to be taking care of them day in and day out, and sometimes being awakened at night by them, and then waking up in the morning to go to school exhausted. Well, she said, this is not something I just read about in this memoir. This is something that I've lived. Well, after the class was over, because in my classes, we ran them like seminars, groups of students or teams would present. All the members of her team and then everybody else in that class gathered around her. She was being, by some of them, actually physically hugged and comforted and told thank you for sharing that with us, but also thank you for taking care of your grandparents in that way. Now, I don't know that the name of God was mentioned at all in that one class that day. I certainly know that Jesus' name wasn't mentioned. I don't think there was even an amen. But if that wasn't a time of prayer, a time of confession, a time of giving thanks, a time of consolation and lifting up, I don't know what those would have looked like or be. I also wrote a chapter, again, well, let me just go back a little bit and say that in this book, what I tried to do is I tried to look in various directions and to various people in various situations, so that I could listen to them talking about prayer, not just in general, not just theoretically, but in their own lives. And so, for example, in the very first chapter, I actually looked at a couple of very well-known theologians, and then, believe it or not, a very brilliant young author who also for a number of years in New York Magazine read a letter column where she would answer people who had sent in questions. So sort of like has been done over the years. And she would do it in a very straightforward, oftentimes very humorous way, but with a great deal of compassion and honesty, talking to people of her own age. She's now probably in her mid-40s. She is married and has kids who are probably teenagers now. But when I was reading her material, it was a good 10 years or so ago. She was still pretty young. Her name was Heather Havrilevsky. And I wrote to her and I said, hey, listen, this is who I am. And I've read your memoir, and I know that you were raised in the church, but you sort of drifted away like many people. But I said, would you have a problem with me using your columns, quoting them? And the only thing she could say is, I'm honored, I'm flattered, I don't know what to say, a priest and a professor writing about my memoir and writing about my columns. She said, are you going to quote me when I use bad words? And I said, I might just do that, because if it makes sense in the moment, why not? That's what you said, to wake somebody up, to get them out of their selfish inwardness. But alongside of them, I listened to perhaps the two best theologians in the UK. Both of them are now retired. One of them I've already mentioned, Rowan Williams, and the other is Sarah Coakley, who now lives in the United States. Both of them are ordained priests. And of course, Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in the case of Sarah Coakley, she actually spent almost 10 years teaching at Harvard Divinity School. So she spent a good chunk of time living here in the States. And now, because both of her children live over here, she and her husband have relocated. He's a scientist, also taught at Oxford and Cambridge like she did. Sarah Coakley has written in a very powerful way about her own experiences of prayer when she got to the point, even though she had studied theology and was ordained and had done parish work, when she simply couldn't pray anymore. It was as if she was a well that had gone dry. And so she went to her spiritual father and said, what should I do? And he said, Sarah, you've read the Desert Mothers and Fathers. You've read St. Augustine. You've read all the church fathers. You know, go read them again, but especially listen to them when they say, don't try to make yourself pray as somebody else does. Just sit there and listen for God and wait for God, and God will show you, give you the words. The Spirit will breathe in you and show you how to pray. So I certainly, it was like finding a treasure when I came across this in her writings. And I wrote to her and I said, Sarah, would you mind? I said, I've admired your work as a theologian. Would you mind if I use this? And she was again flattered and happy and said, if you can share it and give my experience to a wider audience, please do. And she was also very happy, just as Rowan Williams was, that somebody in the Eastern Church was interested in their work. That's ecumenical work, not among experts or at a conference, but in actual lived experience. And then I also used the writings of someone who's now retired like I am, but who was a deacon out in a church in San Francisco, St. Gregory of Nyssa. Her name is Sarah Miles. Her first book was called Take This Bread, and it was about the experience of having been brought up with no religion whatsoever and having had a very hard life. And then walking into St. Gregory's Church one day when the Eucharist was being celebrated and being urged to come up and to take the bread and to take the cup, as is the custom in the Western Church. And she realized that though she wasn't sure what she was doing, something came over her and she felt in the presence of someone. She didn't know what eating the bread and drinking the cup was supposed to mean. That was explained to her later. She was a good example of perhaps somebody who was there among the 5,000 who were told to sit down on the grass and who then had those loaves and fish passed out among them. And all they knew is that they were getting food when they were very tired and hungry. And maybe only later, some of them, at least in the one gospel, heard, this is the bread that was given to your fathers and mothers, the manna in the desert. I am that bread. I am the bread of life. Well, she became a member of the parish. She had been trained as a chef. So her first work in the church there was to set up a food pantry and then to set up a food bank that opened every Friday. And people came in and could fill their baskets or their bags with food that she and a network of people collected from various vendors in the city. This is in San Francisco. And she wrote several other books, and a very beautiful one, which is set on Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent in the Western Church, in which she describes going out into the square. This is in the Mission District of San Francisco. And with other clergy of other churches being there and offering people the ashes, but also offering to pray with them. I have done this ecumenically in a number of places. It's a very moving experience to do this. But she goes from the beginning of the day when she gets up in the morning, all the way through having services for the first day of Lent in church, having them in the morning, and then having services late in the afternoon, the early evening for people who were working. But in between, being out there with many others, giving out ashes and praying for people and listening to them. It's a wonderful day in the life. And I included her because while she would never call herself a theologian, she has no degree, this was like reading. This was not like reading. This was reading a practicing theologian who was a person of prayer. I also went in other chapters and listened to a number of other people. Some of you may know their names or not. I spent a whole chapter listening to Thomas Merton, who I've already mentioned, who for many years published books on prayer from his monastery in Kentucky. I also listened to several poets. Many years ago, my daughter, when she was an undergraduate, introduced me to Mary Oliver, who just died a couple of years ago in her late 80s. She was an absolutely exquisite poet who spent most of her life living up in the Cape Cod area in Massachusetts. Beautiful poems, simple poems. Just remember the name Mary Oliver and go look her up and find a few of her poems. Many of them are online. I just listened to her, and it just so turns out that at a point in her life when she lost her partner, the local parish where the funeral took place befriended her. She had been raised, as many people these days are, with no religion, no experience of learning to pray, learning the scriptures, the catechism, going to church. But this parish community welcomed her in while she was grieving, even gave her a copy of the Book of Common Prayer, taught her all about the services. And she, in thanks, put together a volume of poems that were all about that year and all about her listening to them, but also discovering that all the things she was telling them, she had been doing most of her life, listening to nature, listening to the beauty and seeing the beauty in the sunrise over the beach, walking in the woods in the afternoon, listening to not just the birds, but the insects, watching the change of seasons and the different flights of birds and their migration, uh, meshing all of this with the passage of time, not only in her own life, but in the life of people she loved. And so I used that volume, very slim volume, because she was always very modest in terms of the length of her poems and how many were in a book. I used that as a place of reflection and listening. I also listened to two other authors. One is Christian Wyman, who teaches at Yale Divinity School and who was diagnosed with a very rare cancer and told that there was almost no chance that he would survive. And he and his wife had just had twin girls, and he was only 31 years old. And they said, there is one experimental treatment. It's very risky, it could kill you, but if we don't try it, you're going to die anyway. And having been brought up in the church, in the Baptist church in East Texas, and having kind of moved away from it because of its extreme beliefs, he all of a sudden discovered that he needed God again. And he put it that way, very honestly, and found out that his next door neighbor on the street was a pastor, I think a pastor from the Reformed Church, and who offered to start having coffee. And the pastor said to him, and I won't bring up God. But after a while, Christian Wyman said, I really want to hear you talk to me about God. And Christian Wyman then found his faith again, or I should say, found God who had been looking for him and waiting for him for years. Beautiful book of poems about his year of almost dying. And then, just as with Christ, because several times he uses the motif of death and resurrection, finding all of a sudden that this treatment, this experimental treatment worked. And he had a possibility of life again. And then the last poet I listened to is known for her poetry, but also better known for her memoirs. She's already published 3 volumes, and I understand is working on a 4th. Her name is Mary Karr, Karr. Look her up, especially look up her readings. She is absolutely hilarious. Late in life, after having been brought up with 2 alcoholic parents, and her sister and she having survived near death several times, she received a scholarship, studied at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, went on to do her graduate work at Syracuse University in upstate New York, was in fact very, very close to a number of important writers in the Department of Literature there, and had to come to terms with alcoholism, and spends one whole book of her memoirs called Lit, which is a play on the words literature and then the colloquial term for being drunk, you're lit, telling of her struggle to get sober. And it is also a story of near death and resurrection. And in the process, her one child from a failed marriage due to her alcoholism says to her, Mom, I want to go to church. And so they start touring churches, doing churches. But really, when they find a priest in a Syracuse parish who himself has struggled for sobriety, she says, this is the place. They both get baptized. And to this day, she is a very active, devoted Catholic and has done many, many talks for James Martin and for Stephen Colbert and for other people in the world of journalism and entertainment. And she's done amazing readings. I listened to her poems about her experience because not only did she write memoirs, but she wrote poetry. And then I'll speed this up a little bit. I have a whole chapter of listening to those who care for others in need. And this was a chapter where I listened to not just the lives of Mother Maria Skobtsova and Dorothy Day, but since both of them were very productive writers, I listened to their writings. And if you have never read Dorothy Day's columns from the Catholic Worker or any of her other collections of essays, or the essays of Mother Maria. There is a collection of them in English translation published by Orbis Books. There's a treat waiting for you. These were women of great strength who, after tragedies in their own lives, decided that their mission and their vocation was to set up places that could be houses of hospitality, to shelter homeless people, to feed hungry people, to console those who were troubled, to find medical care, and even in some cases, jobs for those needing them. And one did this in Paris, not only during the Great Depression, but also during the Nazi occupation. And she ended up as a martyr going to the concentration camps for hiding people who the Gestapo were trying to ship off to the extermination camps. She and her son and Father Dmitry Klepinin, the chaplain, and Ilya Fundamensky, who was her treasurer, they all died in the camps, and they were canonized back in 2004. I also had a chapter listening to two people who I'm very much indebted to for my own spiritual life. I've already mentioned one, and that's Serafim Asarov. The other is Paul Evdokimov. I've translated a number of his books and essays. He was a lay theologian. He never got ordained. He was in the first graduating class of St. Sergius Theological Institute in Paris. He graduated in 1928. He studied with Berdyaev, he studied with Bulgakov, and so many others who were there, who were emigres from Russia. What was distinctive about Evdokimov's work is that he didn't produce an academic theology, but he produced writings to encourage people and support them in living out the gospel in their own lives. He and his good friend and teacher, Father Nicholas Afanasiev, really felt that in the Eastern Church, the sense that all baptized Christians are called to be prophets, priests, and kings or queens of the kingdom should be taken seriously. That vocations were not just for monks and nuns and priests and deacons and bishops and so forth, but for everybody. That everybody was called by their baptism to witness to Christ and to live lives for the life of the world. And last but not least, I listened to someone who is very popular. Maybe some of you are aware of his daily meditations and his many, many books, the Franciscan friar and priest Richard Rohr. He is now based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he is part of the Franciscan province of friars there, helps out in the local churches, but also is in residence at the Institute for Contemplation and Action, which is the kind of place where conferences, other than in times of pandemic, are held. They do a lot of work online, even before the pandemic. They did a lot of conferences on Zoom or on other platforms. And what's distinctive about Richard Rohr, who I've also gotten to know and corresponded with, is that he himself has a great background of pastoral service, not the same as mine, but similar. Not only did he serve in parishes as I had done, but he also was a prison chaplain for almost 10 years. And he also taught in a seminary. And now, semi-retired, he continues to lead this institute and produce talks and also gather others to help him give conferences several times a year. They're all online now. So you can see what the point here is that I tried to go to men and to women who were persons of holiness and persons of prayer. And what I tried to do is listen to them, listen first and foremost, and look at their lives. Some of them were long gone, but some of them are still alive. And I also listened because in most cases they had produced books, articles, in some cases homilies, sermons. I didn't neglect one wonderful writer and retired priest and professor in the Episcopal Church, Barbara Brown Taylor. I listened to her writing about darkness, about the struggles we have with ourself, with things like depression and despair and frustration in our lives. She's written a number of other books. In fact, one of the most powerful books about being a priest that I've ever read, called Leaving Church. I highly recommend it. It was introduced to me by one of my former interns who read it when he was in a place for rehabilitation. It's a very, very moving book about how sometimes clergy think that they're God and forget that they're actually the servants of God and the servants of God. So I use some of that in there too. But what I want to do in closing, and I hope you'll put up with me because I've talked now for longer than I ever do, is read you a little bit of one more chapter. And it is a chapter called The Prayer of Forgetting and Remembering. And this chapter starts out with, well, you'll see it in just a minute, but with something that I had made up for myself after I had been humiliated. And I'll let the text speak to you. Do you pray on any regular basis? How many of us do, other than in church on Sunday? Maybe we did when we were children with our parents. But as the years went on, we ended up praying only at church. Does a pastor, does a priest pray? One would think so. One would hope so. Yet, every day as I read the names on an increasingly tattered card that was in my prayer book, I was reminded of how this card came to be. It was the result of my being asked to pray for a family member by a parishioner many years ago. It was a sincere request, an affectionate one too. As the parishioner said, she was sure, Father, that my prayers would help. She was asking me to pray for her mother, who was undergoing tests and surgery. Well, the next Sunday, I had said I would, of course, pray for her mother and didn't, except at that moment. The next Sunday in church, she came up to me beaming and she said, "Your prayers have been successful. They have been so strong. My mother is greatly improved." The reality, however, was that I had forgotten during the week to pray for her mother. I had not remembered to pray for her. And as I realized that I had lost the practice and discipline of daily prayer, which I knew from my days in seminary as a friar, this became the origin of my prayer list. This list has become for me a kind of journal, as well as a map of the last several decades of my adult life. By the way, now there are at least 3 different versions because over time and using my fingers on it, it falls apart. The index card just simply falls apart. I now, believe me, have started to memorize it. I have the whole card memorized as well as 2 other lists. But this is not just a story about me. It is a story and a journal about those with whom I have been connected in those last years of my life. Teachers, friends, family, even a few enemies, parishioners, students, colleagues, relatives. The list is about the web of persons in my life because it is about what I have done and where, because it is about what I once was and have turned into, and therefore it is very much about prayer. Prayer is listening as well as talking to God. Prayer is also about everything that happens in every day of my life. Another way of fulfilling the mandate of St. Paul to pray always. Yes, we forget those who have asked us to pray, but in prayer we also remember. I look at the prayer list every day, run down through the names, remember them, try to pray for them. However, as time has gone on, I find I cannot always recall everything about some of those names. Too much time has passed. It is only first names on the list, too. Sometimes I look back over old parish pictorial directories that I've kept, and this has helped a great deal to add a last name and maybe some memories of a person I had forgotten about. But even with this kind of digging, in some cases the details are sparse. In other instances, though, the memories are intense and vivid. I might remember a particular visit, a specific interaction, the accent and the tone of a voice. Trying to recall and narrate the past also triggers memory retrieval to some extent. I know that in writing the chapter in an earlier book about my time in the Carmelites, I ended up dreaming in startling detail about the interior of the junior seminary buildings in Middletown, New York, where I was a student from the fall of 1961 till the spring of 1965. The same held true for the novitiate house in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and the houses of study in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and Washington, D.C., and finally, the priory in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, where I was a student friar and a high school teacher. So this prayer list has become a map of the last 40 or more years of my life. The list covers a lot of territory and a great deal of living and all that comes with it. There are now 6 different parish communities, and that requires remembering what came before, how I got to be a pastor in those parishes. The list also connects to my teaching all that time and longer at the City University of New York. Mapping that many years, the prayer list names many who have died, some with whom I have lost contact, others who remain part of my everyday life. The list and the life it charts affirm that remembering is prayer. Networks of prayer members, neighbors, colleagues, relatives, friends, and even those with whom we don't get along, enemies, these are all connections for prayer, not just people for whom to recite prayers from a book or send off a Lord have mercy. Like a vine, prayer twists, wraps around, insinuates itself into our experiences until it is completely tied up with what we do, those with whom we live and work, and in the end, who we really are, or better, who we have become. In some cases, only much later on, do we remember what actually happened, how we were, how we changed. In sharing those memories below, I hope to show the manner in which prayer in everyday experience is like a rich tapestry or a mosaic. All the small details of failure and satisfaction, of joy and sadness, they work together. They eventually come to be remembered, to be seen as forming the whole of one's life with God and others, all the turns and twists life brings. I have more, but I'm going to stop there and just say that not long ago on Facebook, somebody asked me to friend them. And while I didn't recognize the name, the face was intriguing, so I friended this person. And this person now is a 54-year-old nurse in White Plains, New York, who was probably 12 or 13 years old the last time I actually saw her in my first parish. It's been that long a time. And while I didn't reach out any further to ask anything more than how are your folks, who turns out both are still alive, I did say, you know, when I looked back in the pictorial directory from 1985 or 4, I do remember you had a brother. And she told me, yes, he's fine. He's got kids of his own. She has one child too. That's just an example of, I didn't have her on my list, but I had lots of other people from that parish on my list. And the one thing that this list has taught me is a great deal of humility as a priest and as an individual. Because as I go down the names in the list, some of them I cannot erase from my memory the visits I used to make. There was a woman who I used to visit whose name was Elvira. She was, when I was visiting her, 99. She was crippled by arthritis, so was in a wheelchair. But she had wonderful neighbors. She was a widow. In fact, all of her children were dead. And her ministry in her little community, in her block, was making sure that there are always cookies, that everybody had cookies. The one thing she could still do was bake. And I remember when she had her 99th birthday, we took her out because she was a big fan. When she came to this country and settled in Brooklyn, she discovered Chinese food, and she became a very big fan. And one of my parishioners who lived next door to her, every Friday night would stop at the Chinese restaurant on the way home from work. She was a lawyer, and bring Elvira whatever Elvira wanted that night from the Chinese restaurant, well, whether it was noodles or whatever. I remember her because while as a young pastor, I was being the visitor to the shut-ins, and I learned very quickly that it wasn't so much me visiting them as them visiting me. Their hospitality, the stories of their past, who they were, the joy. I mean, here was a woman who had already had a lot of loss in her life, but who always had a greeting for me, always had cookies. And, you know, I would have to go over to the stove and get the hot water and make the tea or the coffee for us. But I always felt like she was hosting me rather than me visiting her to bring her communion and anointing and to read the day's lessons and pray with her. That whole first column of my prayer list now are people who are in the heavenly kingdom. But as I said in the portion that I read, there are plenty of other people in there who are still very much alive. One of the columns is made up of 20 years of seminary and interns that we had at St. Gregory's. And while I haven't kept in close touch with all of them, I am in very close touch with several of them. One of them is a monk at New Skeet now, after having been a chaplain. In fact, he was for a time at the Second Street Cathedral with Father Christopher. His name is Father John Frazier. Several of them are doing amazing things. In my new book, I highlight the work of Father Justin Matthews, who he's a director of reconciliation services, which was started by St. Mary of Egypt Orthodox Church in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is an umbrella outreach set of services in an old commercial building in downtown Kansas City, which has a pay what you can cafe named for the now deceased presbytera of the founding priest, but also has all kinds of spaces for counseling services, for well baby visits, for clinics for seniors, for job training, and all kinds of other things that people in need could avail themselves of. It is in particular dedicated to the memory and the model of Mother Maria Skobtsova. And sometime later this year, in a major publication, The Christian Century, part of the chapter in my book will get published about the ministry of outreach at Reconciliation Services, by the way, there in Kansas City. And those folks, Justin and his wife and his 3 boys, one of whom has been struggling with emotional health issues for many years, are all there too. So I'm going to conclude now and say I've talked way longer than I hope to talk. Normally I am much briefer because I believe less is more, but I will stop talking and maybe somebody will have something to say or to ask. And I will just again thank Father Elia and thank you for coming today and listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Father Michael. It was very edifying. I do have some questions, and one of them is what you're saying is deeply moving, but as you well know, maybe in a traditional context, quote unquote, what's tradition, right? Try to describe it. Your approach would be considered as if somewhat new. I'm avoiding the word radical, but the message of Christ is quite radical. How would you propose someone who'd listen to the first time with such suggestion to reconcile everything that we know about what's manifest itself as traditional orthodoxy with your suggestion? How would you, life of prayer, very often understood, that you need to have Jesus prayer in your mind 24/7, and in the middle of the mind, to do something very formal, to set a special time, and there's a gazillion suggestions how to do it.
Yeah.
Not life is prayer, but submission of our life to a very particular liturgical act. How to reconcile these, if you'd suggest?
Well, I would say go back and read or listen to some of the, if you will, the teachers or masters of prayer that are in our tradition, or even in the universal tradition. So if you go back to the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers, these are women and men who chose to live lives focused completely on Christ. They didn't marry, they didn't have families. I mean, at first they simply lived at home, but we recently celebrated St. Anthony of the Desert, a great abbot. He started gathering them into communities, cenobitic communities, communities where they prayed together, ate together, shared their wealth together, and so forth. If you go back and read the sayings, and these are all from, starting in the late 200s of the Common Era, or Anno Domini, and going into the 300s, right? And you read the sayings of Anthony. There's also a Life of Anthony by Saint Athanasius the Great. Abba or Father Pieman, Mother Sarah, Mother Syncletica. There are many, many others. I mean, I can't remember right now how many desert mothers and fathers we have the sayings of. If you put them all together, the ones that have been preserved, there are 3 decent-sized volumes. What you will find there is not different from what I have been presenting today. It is very traditional. I mean, it is 1600 or more years old. And so, for example, when a young brother comes to a father and says, give me a word, Father, the father says, well, what do you want me to tell you? And the answer, for example, in one case is, well, I want to know what prayer is like so that I can pray like you pray. And the one answer he gave is, well, this is Anthony. When I was doubting about this years ago, I asked God, what should I do, Lord? Because I don't think I'm really praying. I'm there for the liturgy in the morning. I pray all the hours. I don't know if he said the prayer, if he called it the prayer of Jesus, but he certainly would keep a verse of the Psalms or the verse, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, in his mind. But he said to God, Lord, you have to show me how I should be doing this, because I don't think that I'm doing it right now. And God said to him, okay. He said, well, go out the door of your cell and tell me what you see. And so Anthony went out the door of his cell. Usually he's depicted as being tormented by devils crawling all over him and offering him drinks and food and everything else. He sees another brother just across the way from him. And the brother is sitting there outside of his cell, and he is plying one of the trades that they all had. I think this brother was weaving baskets out of palms, and these would be then sold and the money given to feed the poor. He also saw down the lane a little bit, one of the other brothers was hoeing in his vegetable garden, because this is how they fed each other. They would share each other's legumes, beans, and potatoes and other things like this. We know that Saint Seraphim of Sarov had his little vegetable garden out when he was a hermit outside of the Sarov monastery. And then I think he saw one more who was doing some woodworking. And he was disappointed. So he went back into his cell as if the only place he could talk to God was in his cell. And he said, okay, Lord, so I saw these brothers and all they're doing is working. He said, go out again. And he went out and there were no brothers. All of a sudden the brothers had disappeared. So he comes running back into the cell and he says, am I going crazy? And God says to him, Anthony, those were all angels, right? They're my messengers. And I sent them to show you that what you are doing is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. He said, what do you do all day long? He said, well, I weave baskets. I tend my garden. I say my prayers in church in the morning and in the evening. And I try to keep my mind on God during the day, but of course I am working with my hands. And it's as if God said to him, bing, there it is. You were doing exactly what you should be doing. You weren't aware that you were doing exactly what you should be doing. In other words, your work and your prayer had become entwined, and that is the whole point. I think Evagrius says that one is truly a theologian who prays. Well, you know, when you are writing out a talk, when I am writing a book or an article, when I am teaching a class like this, am I praying? I think God's answer is you are, just as much as you are praying when you are making pirohi or vareniki, and you're listening to one another, sharing one another's stories. Now, it's not to say that the prayer that we offer during the liturgy, the things we sing, the things we say together, the prayers that are offered at the altar, it's not to say that those aren't prayer. Of course they're prayer. They're prayer par excellence. They are the most concentrated form of prayer that we have. Father Schmemann used to call it the primary theology. There is, all other theology comes from that, knowing full well that most of the prayers that we recite either in the hours or in the liturgy come right out of the scriptures. I think it's 87% of the texts of the services in the liturgy come directly out of the scriptures. They're either direct quotes or they're paraphrases, right? In fact, years ago, a priest in the Antiochian church went through the entire text of the Divine Liturgy, and I think that's where I get stuck in my head the figure of 86 or 87%, and even showed where each line comes from, the Psalms or St. Paul or wherever. Even the anaphora, the Eucharistic prayer of St. John Chrysostom or of St. Basil, for that matter. So that's how I would how I would suggest. I would say, don't listen to me. I'm just Plekon. You know, what do I know? No, go back and listen. Go back and listen to Tikhon Zadonsky. Go back and listen to Seraphim of Sarov. Go back and listen to Abba Anthony and Amma Sarah. Go back and listen, for example, if you want to be a little bit broader and really do consult the tradition. Go ask Teresa of Avila. Go ask John of the Cross. Go ask Father Augustine. Go ask Basil the Great, or Gregory the Theologian, or Gregory of Nyssa. You will find, if you look hard enough in their writings, this eventual realization that our life and prayer become one. Paul Evdokimov had a very lovely way of putting it. He said that the whole point, and he's echoing Seraphim of Sarov here, the whole point is that you become what you pray.
Thank you, Father. I didn't want to hold you too long, but there is this one question that I really wanted to ask.
Sure.
The recent pandemics that we're still plagued by, certainly distorted the common patterns of our church life, including the life of common prayer and such. And it's already probably, we could say, a fact that not everyone is going to come back.
Right.
I'm far from suggesting that we become irrelevant to many, but fears, agitations, and anxieties, whatever it is, and the people came up, and unfortunately, not only here, but even overseas, priests are saying that people just, cutting their ties with the church. And in one of the excuses is, again, I'm far from equating as to what we're saying with what I'm going to say now, but it is, well, I could pray at home. What I'm doing is prayer. So why would I need why would I need to go to church? How you'd answer to that challenge, say, or how would you answer to that approach?
Well, I knew in my research that in the Soviet era, so many churches were closed, even destroyed, so many priests and monks and nuns killed. And we know about this. In fact, I think, isn't today the celebration of the martyrs? Right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, the new martyrs. I remember particularly in the life of Father Alexander Men, his family converted. They were Jews. And they became very close to people in the so-called catacomb church. Interesting people who were very, very open. Most of his mentors, the priests there, taught anything. If they taught anything, they taught that in this time of persecution and fear, that if we're found out, we're all going off to the gulag. All the more should we be concerned with how we live, that our prayer be translated, not like from one language to another, but translated from the words that we say and the services that we hold with coverings on the windows, and making sure that nobody walks out, no priest walks out with a cassock on or raso on. You have to put back ordinary clothes, but inside you would have a service going on. To some extent later on, when he was a priest, Father Alexander Men had to do this because during many of the years when he was a priest, you could do the liturgy in church, you could do services in church, you couldn't hold classes. God forbid you should ever do prayers in somebody's home. You could be turned in for this, right? My background is from the western part of Ukraine, from Galicia now. And for about 5 years back in the early 2000s, a good friend of mine was teaching in Lviv at the Catholic University and had me come back and come there and be a guest lecturer for the students. They were, they wanted to expose them to people from other countries. By the way, they were, this guy was Orthodox, and I'm an Orthodox priest, and they had not only Orthodox lecturers, but they also had others, Roman Catholics, as well as Byzantine Catholics, as well as one I met was a Lutheran. It's interesting, the Lutherans used the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in the church in Lviv. One of the things that I learned about was for how many years the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church had to go underground. So they had their own catacomb church. So they would have services in a barn in a remote part of the farm, or out in the middle of the forest with people keeping watch, or in a house with all the windows covered, just as in Russia, just as in the catacomb churches. I also heard something that I think Father Yaakov had told me about, and that is these churches, maybe you know about them back in the Soviet era, in Odessa, where people would go on holiday, right, for vacation to the beach, right? But that's not only the reason they would go down there, they would go to these churches which would start the baptisms at 7 in the morning and go all day long. And the reason they would have their children baptized there is that it wasn't in their neighborhood at home, and nobody could take down, and even if they took down their names, it didn't make any difference. They lived somewhere else. At least this is what he told me. Well, apparently that was also the case for Ukrainians too. They found ways of working around the situation in which they could not be in church. They could not do what was normal and what was ordinary. Then the Soviet era ended, and they were able to have church services again. I mean, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Hungary, and so many other places that formerly had been part of the Soviet bloc. And they had an explosion of vocations to the priesthood, to the monastic life, and the reopening of so many schools and universities and theological faculties and so forth. And that all started well over 25 years ago when the Soviet era ended. Where are they now? Well, it's not an explosion anymore. Now there is a new generation that has grown up with freedom of religion. You can go to church. You can go to whatever church. You can spend as much time as you want in church. But if you know anything about the figures that are gathered on church attendance in all of those countries, sad to say, they're higher in America, and they've been dropping in America, but they're higher here than they are there. So, this is something that I address in my new book. I don't have an answer for it. I'm not God. But I do know this. I do know that where people want to be the church, where they want to be the people of God, where they want to be the body of Christ, and I mean this not in a theoretical sense like a theologian would say that, but in terms very concretely of this parish community to which they belong, they will find ways to keep going. I mean, and maybe when you see the book, I can't go into it now, but you will see some of the very creative ways in which they do this. So, for example, just one or two examples. One large church in Oakland, California, had not only a big sanctuary, a big nave, but they had a huge building with classrooms, with offices, and they were hardly using it anymore. So the pastor and the very now small congregation there reached out to a number of not-for-profit agencies, just like Reconciliation Services out of St. Mary's Church did in Kansas City, and said, look, this building is in good shape. It does need some work, and the heat needs to be on, and so forth. It needs these things which we're running out of money for. If you use this during the week, if this became a place where you could deliver services that people in the community really need, would you be willing to have a partnership with us in this continuing on the good work of mercy, the works of love? And so the agencies all said, well, yeah, we need more space. We would be glad to help you pay for the heating, pay for the electricity, maintain the place. And so what I call this, or actually what another scholar called this, was repurposing, just a fancier word, repurposing their space. And I discovered as I gathered more stories of parishes doing this in other ways. One parish in North Carolina, for some reason, over the years, several buildings around it had been demolished, and somebody in the parish bought the property and turned them into parking spaces. They now had 3 times as much parking space as they needed. And so the bishop said to them, do you think you could come up with a better use of that land, that space? Well, the long and the short of it was they did. They were able to find a number of people who were able to come in and put up new buildings there. So there's now a clinic there. There's now a place where the local mental health services do counseling. And there are other variations on this theme where, existing space that a parish has that it isn't using at all during the week can be turned into the works of loving kindness for others. So these are ways in which some parishes have found how they could be the body of Christ, not only when they're celebrating the liturgy on Sunday morning, not only when they're having classes for their young people, not only when they're having their coffee hour, but with other people during the week. Now, I said before, my book is not a recipe. It's not a book how to solve your parish's problems, how to make your parish come back to life again, because that's magic. And we're people of faith, not magic. But God is always there. And if we are the people of God, and if we are trying to live out the gospel, and we know something, as some of us do, about the history of the church, then we know that this has been done before. Juliana Lazarevskaya did this. Yosef Volotsky did this. To some extent, St. Sergius himself did this.
Thank you, Father. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening to me. And I wish you all a good rest of the Sunday and a good week. And stay well. We're waiting to get our vaccines here. I hope you get yours soon, and I hope we do too.
Thank you, Father. Please pray for us, and
I will.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.